Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, still talking about the respiratory system. In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about volumes, capacities of breathing, and then we'll look at external and internal respiration, and we'll just mention briefly the circulation as well. So a normal, healthy person breathes in about 500 milliliters of air with each breath. This is half a liter. So if you think about a liter bottle, when you buy a liter bottle of soda or something like that, so half of that's about the volume that you breathe in and out. So not necessarily a lot of air moving in and out. And that, of course, that's under normal circumstances. You're not working out, you're not getting your heart rate up, you're not needing more oxygen. So this is just resting capacity that you're pulling into your body. We call this the tidal volume. So think of it like the tide. The tide is going in, the tide is going out. So the tidal volume is this amount of air that is coming in and going out of your lungs every time you breathe. It's dependent on a number of things. First of all, your size. So of course, if your lungs are bigger, if you're a taller, bigger person, then you're going to be pulling in more air and pushing out more air. The sex, so in general, males are going to have a greater lung capacity than females. Your age as well. And that's something that changes over time. There's a number of things that happen to you as you age. The elasticity of your lungs goes down. The lung capacity goes down. You're not going to be getting as much oxygen to your cells. The CO2 isn't going to be released as easily. And those are just things that come with age. And then also physical condition. The better conditioned you are, the more lung capacity you have, the more volume you're going to move in and out with each breath. But the less air you need when you're resting. So that's kind of an interesting situation. This is a nice little graph that shows the different volumes of air and what they are. So first of all, let me point out the tidal volume, and that's here, this little yellow line, about 500 milliliters again. And notice how it comes in and out. So this is normal breathing pattern. You're just going to have this nice ebb and flow of the tide of 500 milliliters as it goes along. Even though that's normally how much we pull in and push out, we have the ability to pull in and out even more. And we call these the reserve volumes. So we have the inspiratory reserve volume and we have the expiratory reserve volume. And this is how much you can either breathe in or breathe out beyond that 500 milliliters. So let's say you breathe in your 500 milliliters. So you can try this at home as you're listening to this. Take a normal breath in. Just a normal breath. Don't try to pull in more than usual. Just a normal breath in. Once you do that, then breathe in even more. Breathe in then as much as you can. So that first breath is your tidal volume, about 500 milliliters. But beyond that, you have the capacity to breathe in way more, so 3,100 milliliters beyond that 500 milliliters that you just pulled in. And that's there because as you start to exercise, as your body needs more oxygen, we're able to pull in more air, so we can meet the demands of our body to a certain extent. Then once you do that, now you can then breathe out. So push that air back out. We'll push the whole air out, and then go back and do just a normal breathing for a minute, and then after you pull air in, push the air out normally, and that's your tidal volume that you expire, and then breathe out even more, as much as you can. And that's going to be your expiratory reserve volume. And that's about 1,200 milliliters beyond that. So that's normally, we normally breathe 500 in, 500 out, but we have this extra both in and out that our lungs are capable of doing. Altogether, this makes about 4,800 milliliters. So that's a pretty good amount. That's a pretty good amount of air. So that's over 4.5 liters. We call this the vital capacity. So overall, this is how much, and this, of course, it varies from person to person. It varies according to, if you have asthma or any sort of condition, that's going to affect your vital capacity. But you can measure this at the doctor with a spirometer. as you breathe in, say you have this little machine that you can breathe into and see how much volume you can move in and out as you breathe. Anyway, we call this the vital capacity. This is basically the capacity of your lungs, the usable capacity of your lungs. Notice down here, though, we have something called the residual volume. Residual, maybe a definition for that would be sort of leftover, and that's one way to think about residual. So residual volume is, even after you've breathed out as much as you can, there's still going to be some air in your lungs. This is the air that you can't get rid of. It's in your lungs. So your lungs don't totally empty of air even when you breathe out. And so you're left with this residual volume, and it's about 1,200 milliliters. It can also be used. I mean, if there's oxygen available in that air, then the lungs can continue to pass the oxygen to the blood and go around your body. And this is nice because it allows us, even when you breathe out all the air, there still is oxygen, some oxygen available that can be used and pulled out by your body and sent around to the different cells. So it's not like it's a waste, but it's kind of dead space. It's not gonna be breathed in and out with each breath. This makes up the total lung capacity. So you take the vital capacity and you add on the residual volume, and that's going to give us your total lung capacity. That's how much air can be held in your lungs. Just one other thing to point out here on this slide is that the tidal volume is 500 milliliters, meaning that, again, you're pulling in 500 milliliters. Normal breathing, you're pushing out 500 milliliters. But remember, only that air that gets to the alveoli is the air that is going to be used to pull out oxygen. And so a lot of the air, or some, maybe not a lot, but some of the air that we breathe in ends up in the trachea, in the bronchi, and the bronchioles. That air isn't going to go through any sort of exchange. And that makes up about roughly 150 milliliters of the air that you breathe in. So actually, when you take that 500 minus 150 milliliters, we're actually only using about 350 milliliters, or there's only about 350 milliliters of air that is actively being exchanged when we're breathing normally. So that's something interesting to think about as well. We have abbreviations for these terms here. So we call the inspiratory reserve volume the IRV. We call the tidal volume the TV. This is the ERV, and this is the RV. The vital capacity, which we give the letters VC, equals the IRV plus the TV plus the ERV. And then the total lung capacity equals the VC, and then you have to add in the RV as well. And there you have it. That's how our lungs work. That's the air we're able to pull in and push out of our lungs. There are also respiratory sounds that are involved with breathing as well. So you can monitor the sounds that are in the lungs, the sounds of breathing, with a stethoscope, and when you go into a doctor for a checkup or something like that, the doctor will check for these sounds. So we have two main sounds. We have the bronchial sounds, and this is the air moving through the trachea and bronchi. And then you have vesicular breathing sounds as the air is filling up those alveoli. And these are simply important because you want to be able to hear these sounds. So if the sounds don't sound normally, you know something's wrong. So if you have any sort of crackle as you're breathing in, or wheezing, or something called rales, which are abnormal sounds produced by mucus, the presence of mucus in the lung, and the thickening of the bronchial wall. So any of those sorts of sounds are making it so the air isn't able to move into the lungs and out of the lungs as easily. That means there's some sort of problem that needs to be checked and fixed if possible. Alright, let's go on and look at external respiration. So we just looked at pulmonary respiration, and now we're going to look at external respiration. And now this is the inside the lungs. This is the exchange of oxygen and CO2. But remember, this is because the lungs are actually the inside of our lungs are actually outside our body, because they have access to the outside through our mouth, and so we call this the external respiration, even though it's happening inside our body. So this is happening in the alveoli. The oxygen is moving into the blood, and the CO2 is coming out of the blood. The way that oxygen and CO2 moves all deals with diffusion. So diffusion is also a passive system, which means that there's no energy required for diffusion to happen, but you do have to have some sort of concentration gradient, which we talked about very early in this class in one of the first lectures, and you can go back and look at a concentration gradient. But basically what it means is that molecules, this relates to molecules, it relates to a lot of different things, but mainly molecules, that they're going to move from high concentrations to low. And that's what this diffusion is. So high concentrations moving to low concentrations. So oxygen is the same way. Oxygen wants to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So if you think about breathing in, as you're breathing in, the amount of oxygen in your lungs is going to be greater than the amount of oxygen in the blood, because as the blood is circulated around your body, all the cells have pulled out that oxygen. So there's very little oxygen left in the blood as it comes back to the lungs. There's a lot of oxygen in the lungs because you just breathed it in. It's brand new air. And so the concentration in the lungs of oxygen is higher than it is inside the blood. So the oxygen naturally wants to move from the alveoli into the blood. CO2 is exactly opposite. As the blood is moving around the body, taking out oxygen, but it's gaining CO2. So when the blood gets back to the lungs, there's a high level of CO2, a large concentration of CO2 inside the blood, and there's very low CO2 comparatively inside the lungs because you've just breathed this air in, so CO2 wants to go into the lungs. And that's simply it. That's how external respiration happens. Simple diffusion moving along the concentration gradient. So here's a little picture showing this movement here. So here's our alveolar sac. Oxygen, as you breathe in, we have a high concentration of oxygen. There's a low concentration in the blood because it's coming back from the body. Oxygen wants to move into the blood. CO2 is opposite. High concentration of CO2 here because it's picked it up from the cells. Low concentration here, and so it wants to move from high concentration towards the low concentration. I want to take this time though to talk about how oxygen and CO2 are carried in the blood. So here we have a red blood cell. Red blood cell is full of a nice little protein molecule called hemoglobin, and a red blood cell is like a sack of hemoglobin. That's basically all it has. The hemoglobin is an iron-based molecule that binds with oxygen reversibly. So, as you breathe in oxygen, as we breathe in oxygen and it follows its pressure gradient into the blood, this oxygen is going to enter the red blood cells, and it's going to bind with that hemoglobin to become oxyhemoglobin. And that's the way the oxygen is going to be carried around the body. There is a little bit of oxygen that will also dissolve into the plasma, but the majority of oxygen is carried in the red blood cells by the hemoglobin. CO2 is a little bit different. CO2 can bind to hemoglobin, but on a different part of the molecule. So as these red blood cells go to the body cells, as they dump off that oxygen and they pick up CO2, some of that CO2 will bind with the hemoglobin. But the majority of CO2 becomes dissolved in the plasma, the fluid part of the blood. So when CO2 combines with plasma or water, it becomes carbonic acid, which can further break down to something called bicarbonate ion and H-positive ions. Here, this slide here is showing the opposite, because here the CO2 is already dissolved into the fluid, and so as it comes back to the alveoli, the bicarbonate ion is going to be changed to carbonic acid, which will then be changed to CO2 and water, which will then go out into the lungs where it can be breathed out. The important thing here, though, to mention is that H positive right there. That H positive is what makes something acidic. So remembering back again to one of our earlier discussions, acidity is determined by the concentration of H positive ions in a solution, simply. And so as you increase the amount of CO2 in the blood, the CO2 is going to increasingly be changed to bicarbonate ion and an H positive ion, which means that the more CO2 that is dissolved in your blood, the more acidic your blood is going to become. And that is not necessarily, that's not necessarily a problem, but if it becomes too acidic, that does become a problem. And so we don't want to have too much CO2 in our blood. And that's a homeostatic mechanism that is controlled by our body to make sure that the CO2 remains pretty constant. Then after that, the oxygen is carried around the body in respiratory gas transport. So once the oxygen is attached to those red blood cells, the hemoglobin of the red blood cells, it will then travel around the body in transport, and then we'll come to the cells, and this is where we have internal respiration. So internal respiration is the transfer of gases between the blood and the body cells. And so this is almost exactly opposite of the external respiration that we just saw, because in this case the carbon dioxide is leaving the cells and it's moving into the blood, and the oxygen is leaving the blood and moving into the cells. But again, it's a passive process that follows a concentration gradient. So as the red blood cells reach the cells, they've already picked up the oxygen from the lungs, and so there's a high oxygen content here, high concentration of oxygen. The cells have been using that oxygen in cellular respiration. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about digestion. But again, the oxygen is basically being burnt to produce energy inside. So oxygen is being used to burn glucose or food in order to produce energy inside our body. And so as the cells are constantly using the oxygen, they have a low concentration inside the cell. So the oxygen wants to follow the concentration gradient, moving from high concentrations to low concentrations. As cells burn oxygen and food to produce energy, the amount of CO2 inside the cells increases. As CO2 increases, it's going to end up with more CO2, higher concentration inside the cells than inside the blood, because the blood has already dumped off the CO2 in the lungs. And so we have a lower concentration here, so CO2 wants to move into the blood, where it will then promptly mix with water to form carbonic acid, which will then form bicarbonate ion and affect the pH of the blood. So let's look at this figure here. Let's start up here with the blood returning from the body. So as the blood is returning from the cells, here it shows the concentration. So the oxygen concentration in the blood coming back from the body and going into the alveolar capillaries is very low, and CO2 is higher because we dumped oxygen off at the cells and we picked up CO2. As it comes into the alveoli, it comes in contact with the inspired air. So the air inside the alveolar spaces, notice the oxygen content here is huge, and there's almost no CO2 inside the air that's coming in to the body. And so what happens is that the oxygen wants to flow down its concentration gradient as well as CO2, and so we have this exchange happening. As that exchange happens, that lowers the CO2 content in the blood, and it raises the oxygen content in the blood, so that the blood leaving the lungs, leaving the alveolar capillaries, has a much higher concentration of oxygen and a lower concentration of CO2. Notice the CO2 levels don't go down as low as they were in the inspired air, and that's okay. We have a certain level of CO2 in our blood, and that's alright. We want that some bicarbonate ion, we just don't want too much. and then we breathe out the air that we didn't use, and notice that there's still a lot of oxygen in the air you breathe out as well. And so if you were to take a baggie and breathe it, or if, maybe take a baggie and put it over your mouth and don't suffocate, right? But if you breathe that same air in and out a few times, there's still going to be oxygen there. It's going to take a few breaths in order to deplete that oxygen enough that you're going to start to have problems. But notice that the CO2 leaving, so if we compare this to this, we have lower oxygen and we have more CO2 in the exhaled air than we did in the air coming into the lungs. Because that oxygen has moved into the blood, it's going to be traveling around the body, and the CO2 has moved into the lungs. So now this blood is then going to go back to the heart, to the left ventricle. It's going to get pumped to all the body cells. So the blood entering the tissue capillaries, notice, is basically the same as the blood that was leaving the alveolar capillaries. Has a high amount of oxygen and a lower amount of CO2, and it's going to come in contact with the tissues, with the cells of the body. And in the cells we have a low oxygen concentration because we've been doing cellular respiration, we've been losing that oxygen, and we have a high CO2 content because that CO2 has been building up as we burn the oxygen, as we burn the food. So the food turns into CO2 and the oxygen becomes water. So the oxygen is going to want to follow its concentration gradient to lower, and CO2 is going to follow its concentration gradient out into the blood, so that the blood leaving the tissue capillaries has a low amount of oxygen. So notice how it changed over the course here. So we had a lot of oxygen, that oxygen moved into the cells, and so we're left with just a little bit of oxygen. And the CO2, we've picked up CO2 from the cells, and so the amount of CO2 has risen, and then we're going to come back to the heart and then go through the pulmonary circulation to run the whole thing again. So you can see how the concentration gradients of oxygen versus CO2.